The sun hung low over the horizon, painting the land in shades of copper and gold. A soft wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush and dust, whispering across the plains of the old American West. The year was 1886, and the town of Red Hollow sat tucked between rolling hills and the slow, winding river that gave the valley its life. The place was small, just a handful of weathered wooden buildings, a few scattered farms, and one dirt road running straight through its heart. It wasn't much, but for a man with nothing left to lose, Red Hollow looked like a fresh start. He rode into town on a gray mare, coat covered in trail dust, eyes weary from weeks of travel. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that carried stories too heavy to tell. The only thing he owned besides that horse was a folded deed in his saddlebag, the promise of a new beginning. A ranch, his ranch. It wasn't much on paper, just a few hundred acres of dry land and a broken-down barn, but it was something he could build on, something he could claim as his own after losing everything else. The townsfolk watched him with that mix of curiosity and caution small towns always had for newcomers. Old men on porches leaned back in their chairs. A woman at the general store squinted from behind her counter. Even the sheriff gave him a slow, steady look before tipping his hat. Folks in Red Hollow didn't ask too many questions, but they sure liked to think about the answers. He stopped outside the feed store, the leather of his saddle creaking as he dismounted. The sign above the door was cracked and faded, but the man inside looked friendly enough. The store smelled of hay, tobacco, and oil. Barrels lined the walls, filled with grain, nails, and supplies for the long seasons ahead. He bought what he needed: feed, rope, a shovel, a hammer, and a few nails to start patching up his place. When the old storekeeper asked where he was headed, he just nodded and said, "Out west of the ridge. Bought the Jenkins Ranch." The old man's brow lifted. "Jenkins Ranch, huh? Been empty near 3 years. Hard land out there, dry and stubborn. You got your work cut out for you." He smiled faintly. "That's all right. I'm used to hard work." The ride out to the ranch was quiet except for the soft clop of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk. When he crested the ridge and looked down at what he'd bought, his chest tightened. The land stretched wide and lonely, fenced in by the remains of old wood posts leaning in the wind. The house was still standing, though barely, its roof sagging, paint long stripped by sun and storms. The barn looked worse, the doors hanging open like broken jaws. He dismounted and stood still for a moment, listening. The land seemed to breathe, soft, ancient, and patient. He ran his hand along the porch railing, feeling the splinters dig into his palm. The place had seen better days, but there was something alive about it, something waiting to be brought back. He unpacked his gear, started a small fire near the porch, and boiled some coffee. The night came fast, bringing a deep quiet that settled over everything. Coyotes called in the distance. The stars burned sharp and cold above the hills. He sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, and wondered if this was what peace was supposed to feel like, or if it was just the pause before something began. The next morning, he started fixing the barn. The doors were the worst part, warped and swollen from years of rain and sun. When he tried to shut them, they wouldn't budge. He set his boot against the frame, gritted his teeth, and muttered to himself, "Spread it open. Do it with force." The wood groaned, then gave way, the sound echoing across the empty fields. Dust poured out like smoke and sunlight streamed into the dark, stale air. Inside, the place was filled with old tools, broken harnesses, and a few forgotten memories of the family that used to live there. He found a child's wooden toy horse lying half-buried under straw, its paint chipped but still faintly red. He set it on the shelf, feeling a strange pang in his chest. As days turned into weeks, he worked from dawn till dusk. He patched the roof, fixed the well, and cleared the fields of dead brush. Every swing of the hammer felt like a step toward something he couldn't yet name. The townsfolk began to notice. The blacksmith stopped by once, bringing nails. The widow from the mercantile sent a basket of bread with her boy. They said he was bringing life back to the land, though he didn't think much of it. He wasn't trying to be anyone's hero. He just wanted to belong somewhere again. But it wasn't long before strange things started happening on the ranch. At night, he'd hear soft footsteps near the barn when no one was there. The horses would snort and shift restlessly, eyes wide and ears twitching toward the dark. One morning, he found the gate to the corral swinging open, though he'd latched it tight the night before. The wind, maybe, or something else. Then one evening, as he was walking the fence line, he saw her, a young woman standing near the riverbank, her hair dark against the dying light. She wore a simple dress, the hem brushing the tall grass. At first he thought she was a dream, someone's ghost come to remind him of a life he'd lost. But she looked up, eyes bright and real, and everything around him seemed to still. "You're the new owner," she said softly, voice carrying just enough over the water. He nodded, unsure what to say. "Guess I am," she smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This land doesn't take kindly to strangers. It remembers things." Before he could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared into the trees, her figure fading with the last of the light. He stood there long after she was gone, the sound of the river whispering through the dark. That night, he couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in his mind. This land remembers things. He thought about the toy horse, the broken fences, the silence that hung over the fields. The wind seemed to carry voices now, faint but familiar. He told himself it was just the loneliness playing tricks on him, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. Days passed, and the ranch began to take shape. The well ran clear again. The grass grew thicker near the stream. Even the air felt lighter somehow, as if the land was waking up along with him. Yet every time he looked toward the river, he half expected to see her there again, watching. One afternoon, while mending the corral fence, he found something buried in the dirt, a rusted tin box, small and sealed shut. He pried it open carefully with his knife, revealing a few old photographs and a letter. The paper yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was shaky, but still readable. It spoke of loss, of a child who never made it through the winter, and a promise that the land would never forget. He sat there for a long while, staring at the letter, feeling the weight of it settle on his heart. It wasn't just his ranch anymore. It was theirs too, the ones who'd come before, the ones whose stories still lingered in the wind. When he looked up, he saw her again, standing at the edge of the field, watching him with those same unreadable eyes. She didn't move or speak, just stood there, half in shadow, half in light. He rose slowly, the letter still in his hand. "Who are you?" he called out. But before she could answer, a gust of wind swept through the valley, scattering dust and leaves around them. When it cleared, she was gone. And in the silence that followed, the rancher realized something had changed. The land wasn't quiet anymore. It was awake, and it was waiting. He folded the letter, slipped it into his pocket, and looked toward the dark line of trees beyond the river. Whatever story this land held, he was now part of it, and deep down, he knew it was only just beginning. The next morning came with a heavy fog that blanketed the fields like a ghostly tide. The rancher stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots, and breathed in the damp air. It carried the smell of wet soil and cedar, and something faint, like smoke, though there was no fire in sight. He scanned the horizon, half expecting to see that strange woman again near the riverbank. But the mist swallowed everything. Only the faint outlines of the barn and fence posts broke the gray. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot hanging over the small fire he'd kept alive through the night. The letter he'd found still sat on the table beside him, its edges curled from the damp. He had read it over and over, but the words still gnawed at him. For the land remembers the lost, and it keeps their promise until someone listens. He wasn't sure what it meant, but something deep inside told him it wasn't just a figure of speech. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing the sun climbing behind a line of low clouds. He saddled up his mare and rode out across the property, tracing the boundaries to get a better sense of the land he'd bought. The hills to the north were rough and rocky, dotted with sagebrush and prickly pear. To the south, the river cut through a wide stretch of meadow where the grass grew thick and green. It was beautiful country, wild and untouched, but there was an uneasy stillness about it too. As he rode past the riverbank, he noticed footprints in the mud. They were small, maybe a woman's, leading from the water toward the grove of trees. He dismounted and crouched down, touching one lightly. It was fresh. She had been there recently. He followed them for a short distance, pushing through the brush until they faded near an old stone wall half buried in vines. It looked like part of an old foundation, maybe from a cabin long gone. He brushed away the weeds and found carvings etched into the stones. Names, faint but still visible. One of them matched the signature from the letter. He stood there for a moment, feeling a strange chill. This place had a past that wasn't written in any deed or record. It was written in the land itself, in the marks left behind by those who'd lived and died here long before he arrived. Later that day, he rode into town to pick up more supplies. Red Hollow was busier than usual, the sound of wagon wheels and laughter spilling into the dusty street. At the general store, he loaded up on flour, salt, and lamp oil. The woman behind the counter, her gray hair pinned neatly beneath a bonnet, recognized him now and greeted him with a warm but cautious smile. "Settling in all right?" she asked. "Trying to," he said. "The place needs a lot of work." Her smile faded just slightly. "That old ranch has seen plenty of hard years. Folks say it's cursed, though I don't hold to such talk myself." "Cursed how?" "Oh, you know how people are," she said, lowering her voice. "Stories get passed down. They say the Jenkins family lost everything. Drought took their crops, sickness took their boy. When the mother passed, the father couldn't bear it. They say he disappeared one night, just gone. Some think he went out to the river and never came back." He frowned, remembering the letter and the woman by the water. "You ever hear anything about someone still living out that way?" The woman's eyes narrowed a bit. "Not in years. Maybe a traveler or two camped nearby, but no one stayed for long. That land has a way of holding on to what it wants." He thanked her and left, the sound of her words following him out the door. Holding on to what it wants. It sounded more like a warning than gossip. By the time he returned to the ranch, the sun was sinking low again, turning the sky a deep red. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the loose boards of the barn. He unsaddled the mare and went to check the fences. That's when he noticed it. The toy horse he'd left on the shelf in the barn was gone. He looked around, thinking maybe it had fallen, but it wasn't anywhere in sight. He searched the floor, the stalls, even the hayloft, but there was no sign of it. Then he saw movement near the door. Someone or something was standing just outside, half hidden by the dusk. He froze. The figure was small and still, almost like a shadow that had taken shape. When he stepped closer, the figure slipped away into the darkness. He ran after it, but the night swallowed everything fast. Only the sound of the wind and his own heartbeat filled the air. He stopped, realizing he was near the same grove of trees by the river. The moonlight shimmered on the water, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw her again, the woman in the plain dress, standing knee-deep in the stream, her hands resting on the surface as if she were feeling for something beneath. But when he blinked, she was gone. The next morning he found the toy horse again sitting neatly on the porch beside his boots. It hadn't been there when he went to sleep. He picked it up and turned it over in his hands. It was clean, as if someone had wiped the dirt away. The more time he spent on the ranch, the more the land seemed to come alive around him. The well never ran dry, even though rain hadn't fallen in weeks. The horses grew strong and restless, their coats shining in the sun. The grass near the river grew taller every day. Yet with each small miracle came a deeper unease. Sometimes at dusk he'd catch faint glimpses of figures moving among the fields. Men, women, even a child's silhouette near the barn. They never came close, never made a sound. But they were there, always at the edge of sight. He began to wonder if they were memories rather than people, fragments of the past that the land refused to let go. One evening, as he worked late repairing the fence near the southern field, he noticed something strange in the dirt. The soil was darker there, almost black and soft underfoot. When he dug into it with his spade, he uncovered bits of wood and what looked like pieces of an old crossbeam. He realized it wasn't just part of a fence. It was the corner of a small, collapsed structure. Beneath it lay a cracked stone marker, the writing barely visible. He wiped away the dirt and could just make out the words, "For our boy. May the land keep you safe." He sat back, the wind carrying the faint sound of the river through the trees. The child from the letter, the toy horse, it all connected now, but not in any way that brought comfort. That night, as he sat by the fire with the letter spread out before him, he thought about what the woman by the river had said, that the land remembers. He began to wonder if maybe she wasn't a ghost at all, but something else entirely. Someone still bound to this place, watching over it or warning him. He wrote a note of his own before turning in, a habit he'd picked up during his time alone. Just a few lines about the day, about the strange discoveries, and about the sense that he was being tested. He folded it, set it beside the letter he'd found, and blew out the lamp. Sometime deep in the night he woke to a noise, a soft knock on the window. 3 taps, slow and steady. He sat up, heart pounding. The moonlight fell across the room, pale and cold. He waited, listening. Then came the sound again, this time from the door. He grabbed his lantern and went to the front room. The door creaked as he opened it, and the night air rushed in, sharp and cool. No one was there, only the wide, empty yard and the whisper of the wind. But when he looked down, he saw footprints in the dust, small ones, leading away from the porch toward the barn. He followed them with the lantern's glow flickering ahead of him. When he reached the barn, He found the doors open, swinging gently. Inside, the toy horse was lying in the center of the floor, next to a single small handprint pressed into the dirt. The lantern flame trembled. He knelt slowly, his breath shallow. The air in the barn felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. And then he heard it. A soft voice just behind him, barely louder than the wind. "You found him." He turned sharply, the lantern spilling light across the room, but there was no one there. Only the sound of the horses shifting uneasily in their stalls and the creak of the rafters above. He stood there for a long time, the lantern shaking in his hand, his heart thudding in his chest. Whatever this place was, whatever had happened here, it wasn't finished yet. The land wasn't done remembering, and neither, it seemed, was he. The morning after the strange knocking, the rancher barely slept. The air inside the house felt thick and uneasy, as if the walls themselves were listening. He went about his chores slower than usual, distracted by the memory of that whisper in the barn. Every sound seemed sharper, the creak of the windmill, the rustle of dry grass, the flap of a loose shutter. The land was beautiful, yes, but it was never still. It seemed to be breathing around him, restless and watchful. He spent the day working the northern fence, trying to keep his mind busy. The sky was wide and cloudless, the kind of blue that made the edges of the earth look endless. He worked until his hands were sore, driving nails and stretching wire, but every time he looked up he thought he saw someone just beyond the line of trees. A flicker of movement, a figure too far to make out. When he rode closer, the field was empty again. By sundown, he decided to ride into town. He told himself it was for supplies, but deep down he wanted to hear another human voice. The ride into Red Hollow felt longer than usual, the sky fading from gold to deep purple, the crickets starting their nightly song. When he arrived, the lamps were lit along the main street, and a few folks were gathered outside the saloon, swapping stories. He tied his horse outside and stepped in. The place smelled of whiskey, sweat, and dust. A piano played faintly in the corner, and a few men turned to glance his way before going back to their drinks. He ordered coffee from the bar. He didn't trust his thoughts enough for liquor that night, and found a quiet seat near the back. After a few minutes, the sheriff came in. He was a tall man with weathered skin and tired eyes, someone who looked like he'd seen the worst of both people and land. He sat down across from him uninvited, resting his hat on the table. "Heard you bought the old Jenkins place," the sheriff said, his tone casual but probing. "I did," the rancher replied. "Been fixing it up. Land's got good bones." The sheriff gave a low grunt. "That land's got a story, too. You seen anything strange out there?" The rancher studied him carefully. "What kind of strange?" The sheriff leaned back, chair creaking. "Things folks can't explain. Lights near the river. Voices. Some say they've seen a woman out that way, always near sundown. Never speaks to anyone. The old-timers think she's tied to the land somehow." The rancher didn't answer right away. The sheriff's eyes stayed on him, steady and unreadable. "I've seen her," the rancher said finally. "Down by the river. She told me the land remembers things." The sheriff's brow furrowed. "That sounds like her. The Jenkins wife used to say that same thing before she passed. Lost her boy during the hard winter. Afterward, she started saying the land had taken him and wouldn't let go. Some say she went mad. Others think she found a way to stay." The rancher felt the weight of the words settle deep in his chest. "You believe that?" "I believe some places keep their pain," the sheriff said softly. "And some people can't leave it behind." Before the rancher could ask more, a commotion near the saloon doors broke their conversation. A young man had stumbled in, wild-eyed and pale, his hands shaking. "Down by the river," he shouted. "Something's out there, something moving near the water." The sheriff stood up fast, hand on his holster. The rancher followed him out into the street, where a few townsmen were already grabbing lanterns and rifles. The young man led them through the dark, his words tumbling out in panic. He'd been fishing near the river and heard crying, soft at first, then louder, until it sounded like someone wailing right behind him. When he turned, no one was there, but the sound had followed him all the way back toward town. By the time they reached the river, the night was thick with fog. The lanterns cast small circles of light on the ground, but everything beyond them was shadow and whisper. They split up, moving slow along the water's edge. The rancher kept close to the sheriff, their boots sinking into the damp earth. Then, faintly, he heard it too, a sound like sobbing coming from somewhere ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to raise the hairs on his neck. They followed it toward a cluster of trees. The sheriff raised his lantern, and the light fell on something hanging from one of the low branches. A bundle of cloth tied with rope. It wasn't a person, just an old dress, weathered and gray, swaying gently in the wind, but the air around it felt heavy, charged. The sheriff touched the fabric carefully, then dropped it fast, his expression dark. "That's hers," he muttered. "That's the dress the Jenkins woman was buried in." The group stood silent for a long moment before heading back toward town, uneasy and pale. The rancher stayed behind a little longer, staring at the empty branch and the dark river beyond it. The land wasn't cursed, he thought. It was grieving. Over the next few days, things grew stranger still. The wind carried whispers through the fields. Sometimes, while he worked, he'd hear faint laughter like a child's and turn to see nothing. The water in the troughs rippled even when the air was still. One morning, he found the letters he'd kept on the table scattered across the floor. The one from the Jenkins family resting open with a new stain of water on the edge, as if someone had touched it with wet fingers. Then the dreams began. They came almost every night, visions of the ranch as it once was, alive with movement and light. He saw the Jenkins family, their laughter carried on the wind, their boy running barefoot through the grass with that same wooden toy horse in his hands. Then the scenes shifted. Storms rolling in, the boy coughing, the mother kneeling by the river, her tears mixing with the rain. He always woke before the end, heart pounding, the echo of her voice still ringing in his ears. Don't let it happen again. By the fifth night, the dreams were so real that he started leaving the lamp burning beside his bed, but light didn't seem to keep the darkness out. The line between what was real and what wasn't had started to blur. He decided to visit the church on the edge of town, hoping for answers. The preacher was an old man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly when he spoke. He listened quietly as the rancher told him everything. The woman, the letter, the sounds in the night, the child's laughter. When he finished, the preacher folded his hands and said, "Some lands carry sorrow like a scar. You can't erase it, but you can tend to it, same as you'd mend a wound. How do you tend to something you can't see?" The rancher asked. "You listen," the preacher said simply, "and you show the land it still loved." Those words stayed with him as he rode back. That evening he walked the fields instead of working, taking his time to look at everything. The grass, the river, the hills glowing orange under the setting sun. He spoke softly to the land as if it could hear him, telling it he wasn't here to take or to change what was, only to make it whole again. The air seemed to calm just for a moment, but peace never lasted long on that ranch. That night, a storm rolled in fast from the west. The wind howled through the trees and rain came down hard, drumming against the roof. He rushed to the barn to make sure the horses were safe, fighting against the wind to keep the doors closed. Between flashes of lightning, he saw movement inside, a small figure standing in the middle of the aisle. It was the boy, the same one from his dreams. His clothes were soaked, his hair dripping, his eyes wide and empty. The rancher froze, unable to move or speak. The boy lifted his hand slowly, pointing toward the far corner of the barn. Then, just as another flash of lightning lit the room, he was gone. Heart racing, the rancher walked to where the boy had pointed. The ground there looked different, the dirt darker and softer. He knelt down and began to dig with his hands. After a few moments, his fingers struck wood. A small box, water damaged but intact. He lifted it out carefully and opened it. Inside were faded photographs, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, and a note that read, "Forgive me. I couldn't keep him safe." Thunder cracked overhead, and he stumbled back, the letter clutched tight. The wind blew the barn doors wide open again, the storm raging outside. For a moment, he thought he saw her, the woman from the river, standing in the doorway, her dress billowing in the rain. She looked at him with eyes full of sorrow, then turned and vanished into the night. He stood there long after she was gone, soaked to the bone, staring at the open box. Whatever had happened here all those years ago wasn't over. The land was still waiting for something, for someone to understand, to set it free. And whether he wanted to or not, he knew that someone was him. The storm didn't stop until dawn. The sky turned gray and cold, the air thick with the smell of wet earth. The rancher barely slept. He sat near the dying fire, the small box resting on the table beside him. The letter inside was smudged and fragile, but he could make out most of the words. The handwriting was hurried, desperate. It spoke of guilt, of losing a child to sickness and then to the land itself. "I hear him at night," it read, "calling for me from the river. I tried to bring him home, but the water wouldn't let him go. If anyone finds this, tell him I'm sorry." He read those lines again and again until the light crept through the cracks in the shutters. He could feel something changing in the air, like the storm had shaken something loose that had been buried for years. The land was quiet that morning, almost too quiet. Even the birds didn't sing. The horses in the barn stood restless, shifting and snorting, their ears flicking toward the river. He spent the day pacing the property, studying the ground, following the faint signs that led from the barn toward the water. The rain had washed away most of the footprints, but he still felt a pull, as if something beneath the surface was guiding him. He didn't want to believe the stories, but the evidence kept stacking up. The letter, the dreams, the whispers. There was no denying that the Jenkins family hadn't simply vanished. They were still here, waiting. By noon, the clouds broke apart and sunlight spread across the valley, soft and warm. For a moment, it almost felt normal again. He decided to ride into town, partly for supplies, but mostly to talk to the sheriff once more. He needed someone else to see what he'd found, to tell him whether he was losing his mind or uncovering something real. The ride into Red Hollow felt heavy. The trails were muddy, and every hoofbeat sank deep into the wet earth. When he reached town, the streets were quiet. The sheriff was outside his office, sitting on the steps with a cigarette between his fingers. He looked up when the rancher approached. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the sheriff said. "Maybe I have," the rancher replied. He handed him the letter. The sheriff read it slowly, his eyes narrowing. When he finished, he folded it carefully and let out a long sigh. "This was Jenkins's handwriting," he said. "No doubt about it. But if you found this buried under the barn, then maybe the rumors were right. Folks always said he couldn't live with what happened. Some believed he took his own life. Others thought the land swallowed him whole." The rancher hesitated. "You think he's still out there?" The sheriff looked toward the horizon, his expression grim. "I think some things don't stay buried, especially when they're tied to grief. If you're set on finding the truth, you'd best be careful. That river's taken more than one man who went looking for answers." When the rancher returned home, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. He stabled his horse and stood by the porch watching the light fade. The air had gone still again. The land seemed to be holding its breath. He thought about the woman, about her words the first night he saw her. The land remembers things. It felt like she'd been trying to tell him something important, something he hadn't yet understood. He brought the small box back to the river, where he'd first seen her. The water was calm now, reflecting the orange glow of the evening sky. He knelt by the edge and placed the box on the ground. "I know this was yours," he said quietly. "I don't know what you want me to do, but I'll listen." At first, nothing happened. Then a sudden gust of wind rippled across the water, and the surface shimmered as if something moved beneath. A faint sound followed, a voice soft and trembling rising with the wind. It was a woman's voice, calling a name he couldn't quite make out. He stood scanning the trees, heart pounding. The voice came again, clearer this time, closer. Then, through the mist, he saw her. She was standing across the river, the same pale dress clinging to her in the fading light. Her hair hung loose, her face shadowed. "He's still waiting," she said, her words carrying easily across the water. "He can't rest until he's found." The rancher tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Where is he?" he finally asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned slowly and pointed toward the far end of the property, toward the grove of trees where the old stone wall stood. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she faded into the mist. The air grew cold. The light vanished fast, and he knew he shouldn't stay out after dark, but his feet moved on their own. He walked across the field, past the fences toward the grove. The trees whispered softly above him, their branches shifting in the wind. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and roots. When he reached the wall, he saw something he hadn't noticed before, a narrow gap between the stones. Leading to a small clearing, he pushed through, his hands scraping against the rough rock, and stepped into the open space. The clearing was small, overgrown and silent, but at its center, half hidden under years of grass and mud, was a single wooden cross. It leaned slightly to one side, weathered and splintered. The ground around it looked disturbed, as if something had been buried there long ago. He dropped to his knees and brushed the dirt away with his hands. Beneath the cross was another stone marker, cracked but still legible. The name carved into it matched the one from the letter, the Jenkins boy. His stomach tightened. The river hadn't taken him after all. He was here. As he uncovered more of the grave, he noticed something odd. The earth beneath wasn't solid. It shifted slightly as he pressed against it, almost as if it were hollow. He hesitated, then reached for his spade and began to dig. The soil gave way easily, the damp earth crumbling under his hands. Then suddenly the spade struck wood again. It wasn't a coffin. It was another box, larger than the one he'd found in the barn. He knelt down and lifted the lid slowly. Inside, instead of bones, he found a bundle of papers tied with a strip of cloth, letters, journals, each one covered in the same handwriting, the father's. He opened the first page. The boy is gone. The land won't give him back. Every night she goes to the river, calling for him, and every night the water answers. I can't stop her. The land wants her too. If I bury the truth, maybe the land will sleep. His hands trembled. The words blurred as his eyes burned. He flipped through the pages, each one worse than the last. Descriptions of sleepless nights, of whispers in the dark, of the sound of a child crying near the barn. The final entry was dated the day before the family vanished. Tomorrow I end it. The land must keep what it's taken. It won't stop until it's done. The rancher sat back staring at the papers. The truth was here, buried beneath years of silence. The Jenkins family hadn't been victims of bad luck or wild tales. They'd been consumed by something much older, something that demanded remembrance. A low rumble echoed through the ground. At first he thought it was thunder again, but the sky was clear. The vibration grew stronger, rippling through the soil. The trees around the clearing began to sway, though there was no wind. Then, faintly, he heard the same child's laughter again. Soft at first, then rising into a cry that filled the entire valley. He stumbled to his feet, clutching the box, and looked toward the river. A mist was rising again, thick and fast, swallowing the land in gray. Through it, shapes began to move, silhouettes of figures, dozens of them drifting between the trees. The woman's voice came again, closer now, trembling and broken. You opened it, she said. Now the land will remember everything. The rancher backed away, heart hammering. The earth beneath him began to shift, the ground cracking open along the roots of the trees. The sound of rushing water grew louder, though the river was still a good distance away. He turned and ran, stumbling through the brush, the mist curling around him like smoke. The sound followed, voices rising, the wind howling through the valley, the ground trembling with every step. By the time he reached the porch, the air was electric, the sky flashing white with unseen lightning. The house groaned as if the land itself were pushing against it. He dropped the box on the table and looked out toward the fields. The mist had spread across everything, rolling toward the ranch like a living thing. He stood there, breathing hard, mud clinging to his boots, the echo of that child's laughter still ringing in his ears. The truth was no longer buried. The land was awake now, and it was coming for what it was owed. In the distance near the river, he saw her again. The woman stood still, her dress glowing faintly in the storm's light. This time she didn't vanish. She just waited, her gaze locked on the house as if daring him to come back, and deep inside he knew he would, because the answers were there, buried in the soil and the sorrow of this place. The land had remembered, and before the night was over, it would make him remember too. The mist hung heavy through the night, swallowing the valley and wrapping the ranch in an uneasy stillness. The rancher stood inside the doorway, his hand resting on the rifle, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against what was coming. The air trembled faintly, carrying with it the soft sound of water running where no stream should be. He could feel the land breathing, alive, restless, and remembering. For a long moment, he didn't move. The box sat open on the table beside the dying lantern. The papers inside shifted slightly in the draft, whispering faintly like the voices outside. Then, almost without thinking, he reached in and lifted one of the letters. It was the final one, written by Jenkins' wife. Her handwriting was uneven and broken. If the land keeps us, it read, let whoever finds this forgive us. We only wanted peace. Tell the earth we are sorry for what we took. The words struck deep. He realized then that this wasn't about ghosts seeking revenge. It was about a family who had tried to bury their guilt instead of facing it. The land hadn't turned against them. It had simply refused to forget. Outside, the wind began to calm. The mist shifted, pulling back slightly as if listening. The rancher took a breath and stepped out onto the porch. His boots sank softly into the wet earth. He carried the box with him, holding it close to his chest. The woman stood by the river again, glowing faintly in the dim light. This time she didn't look angry or sorrowful, only tired, as if she'd been waiting too long. I found them, he said, his voice steady though his heart was pounding. I know what happened. You don't have to wait anymore. Her eyes lifted toward him, soft and distant. The air around her shimmered, faint like morning fog burning away. He still calls, she whispered. He doesn't understand. The rancher nodded slowly. Then let's help him understand. He walked to the riverbank and placed the box on the ground. The water lapped gently at the edge, quiet now. The woman knelt across from him, her hands trembling as she touched the surface. A ripple spread outward, and for the first time the mist began to lift from the valley. He could see faint shapes fading in the light, silhouettes of the Jenkins family standing together, the child between them. The boy looked up at his mother, then back toward the rancher. His small hand reached out once, uncertain, and then the river brightened with a golden hue that washed over everything. The woman smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. Then the light swallowed her. The figures faded into the river like morning dew. When the last trace of mist disappeared, the valley grew still again. The air was clean, sharp with the scent of rain and grass. The rancher stood there for a while, watching the river return to its natural calm. He could hear the horses in the distance, restless but quiet now. The land felt different, lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been lifted from it. He buried the box by the grove where he'd found the grave. He used his hands instead of a shovel this time, letting the soil fall gently over it. As he worked, he spoke softly, not prayers exactly, but words of thanks. Thanks for the truth, for peace, for the chance to understand. When he finished, the first rays of morning sunlight touched the field, breaking through the clouds. The land gleamed with new color, green, alive, forgiving. In the weeks that followed, life began to return to normal. The strange noises stopped. The dreams faded. The ranch felt warmer somehow, less like a haunted piece of history and more like a home again. He repaired the old barn, cleared the overgrown grove, and built a small fence around the graves. Sometimes he'd leave flowers there, wild ones from the field, just to keep the memory alive. He didn't want the land to forget again, but this time the memory was peaceful. People from town came out to visit after hearing that the old Jenkins place had finally settled. The sheriff stopped by one afternoon, tipping his hat as he looked around. "Feels different here," he said. "Quieter." "It is," the rancher replied, leaning on the fence. "I think it's finally at peace." The sheriff nodded, then looked toward the horizon. "Guess some stories need to be told before they can rest." The rancher smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "They do." Years passed and the ranch thrived again. The soil grew rich, the crops strong, and the horses healthy. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he could still hear faint laughter near the river. Not haunting, just soft, like a family's memory carried gently by the breeze. He never felt afraid again. The land wasn't something to be feared. It was something to respect, something that remembered every hand that had shaped it. Every sorrow, every kindness. One evening, long after sunset, he sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the crickets and the steady rush of the river. The stars stretched across the sky, bright and endless. He thought about the woman one last time, the way she had looked when the light took her, the relief in her face. Somewhere deep down, he believed she was still watching over the land, not as a spirit trapped in grief, but as part of the soil and wind and rain. He realized then that the land hadn't just remembered their pain, it remembered their love too. It remembered everything. That was its nature, to hold stories, both bitter and beautiful, until someone cared enough to listen. The rancher stood and walked down toward the river. The moonlight glowed on the water, turning it silver. He knelt by the edge, dipped his hand into the cool stream, and smiled faintly. "You can rest now," he murmured. "I'll take care of it." The water rippled once, as if answering. Then it stilled. From that night on, peace never left the valley. Travelers who passed through said the place felt alive, full of quiet energy. They spoke of how the river shimmered brighter at dawn, and how the fields seemed to breathe beneath the morning mist. Some said they felt watched, but in a gentle way, like the land was making sure they treated it kindly. And the rancher, older now, never forgot what the land had taught him. He told the story sometimes to those who asked why he stayed there alone all these years. He would tell them that the earth listens, that it holds the truth beneath its surface, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. That grief doesn't vanish. It simply changes form, turning into something that grows and teaches. He would end his story with a small smile, looking toward the horizon where the river bent out of sight. "The land remembers," he would say, "but if you love it enough, it remembers kindness too." On his last evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, the rancher sat by the grove once more. The air was warm, filled with the hum of summer insects. He closed his eyes and felt the breeze brush gently across his face. For a moment he thought he heard that familiar laughter again, soft, joyful, carried from the river, and in that sound, he found comfort. It wasn't haunting anymore. It was a promise that everything lost can find its way home, that even the deepest wounds can heal if given time, truth, and care. The sun sank behind the hills, and the valley glowed for a few lingering minutes before fading into dusk. The land stretched wide and quiet, whole again. The river flowed steady and calm, carrying with it every story it had ever known. By morning, the house would stand still and silent, the porch empty but peaceful. The flowers by the grove would sway gently in the wind, and though no one saw him leave, those who later visited said they could feel him there, part of the land he had made his peace with, watching over it, the same way it had once watched over him. And so, the story ended where it began, with the land, alive, remembering, and forever holding the echoes of those who had loved it enough to listen.